Hi everyone, I'm Cheyenne S. Gines, and for today's report, I'm going to discuss about Gagne's conditions of learning. Before I start my report, let's open this topic with the quote, "Different internal and external conditions are needed for each type of learning." This is according to Robert M. Gagne. At this point, let us have an overview of the report. Gagne's conditions of learning. In his theory, Gagne specified several types or level of learning. He stressed that different internal and external conditions are needed for each type of learning. Thus, in his theory, is called conditions of learning. With that, he provided 9 instruction events that serve as basis for sequencing of instruction, and this will be tackled for today's report. The objective of this lesson is first, to explain Gagne's conditions of learning. Second, know how to make a simple outline, the teaching sequences using Gagne's instruction events. And lastly, to articulate the benefits of using Gagne's principles in teaching. Gagne's theory deals with all aspects of learning. However, the focus of the theory is on intellectual skills. The theory has been utilized to design instruction in all domains. In the earlier version of the theory, special attention was given to military training settings. Later, Gagne also looked into the role of instructional technology in learning. Now, let's talk about Gagne's principles. The first principle is different instruction is required for different learning outcomes. Gagne's theory asserts that there are several different types or levels of learning. Furthermore, the theory implies that each different type of learnings call for different types of instruction. Gagne named 5 categories of learning. First is verbal information, second, intellectual skills, third, cognitive strategies, fourth, motor skills, and lastly is attitude. In the next slide, we're going to talk about the categories of learning with their corresponding learning outcomes and conditions of learning. Here are the 5 categories of learning. First, let's talk about verbal information. So, example of learning outcome: stating previously learned materials such as facts, concepts, principles, and procedures. Conditions of learning. First, draw attention to distinctive features by variations in print or speech. Second, present information so that it can be made into chunks. Third, provide a meaningful context for effective encoding of information. And lastly, provide cues, effective recall, and generalization of information. Second category is intellectual skills. Under intellectual skills is these 5. First is discriminations, second is concrete concept, third is defined concept, fourth is rules, and lastly is higher order rules. Now let's talk about the example of learning outcome. First is discriminations. It is distinguishing objects, features, or symbols. For example, distinguishing an even and odd number. Second, concrete concepts. Identifying classes of concrete objects, features, or events. For example, picking out all the red beads from a bowl of beads. Third is defined concepts. Classifying new example of events or ideas by their definition. For example, noting that she sells seashells as alliteration. Fourth is rules. Applying a single relationship to solve a class of problems. For example, computing average monthly income of a company. Lastly, order rules. Applying a new combination of rules to solve a complex problem. For example, generating a balanced budget for a school organization. Now, let's talk about the conditions of learning for intellectual skills. First, call attention to distinctive features. Second, stay within the limits of working memory. Third, stimulate the recall of previously learned component skills. Fourth, present verbal cues to the ordering or combination of component skills. Fifth, schedule occasions for practice and space review. And lastly, use a variety of contexts to promote transfer. Now, let us move on to the third category of learning, which is cognitive strategies. Example of learning outcome: employing personal ways to guide learning, thinking, acting, and feeling. For example, constructing concept maps of topics being studied. Functions of learning for cognitive strategies. First, describe or demonstrate the strategy. Second, provide a variety of occasions for practice using strategy. Provide informative feedback as to creativity or originality of the strategy or outcome. The fourth category of learning is attitudes. So, example of learning outcome: choosing personal action based on internal states of understanding and feeling. For example, deciding to avoid soft drinks and drinking at least 8 glasses of water every day. The conditions of learning under attitudes. First, establish an expectancy of success associated with the desired attitude. Second, assure student identification with an admired human model. Third, arrange for communication or demonstration of choice of personal action. And lastly, give feedback for successful performance or allow observation of feedback in the human model. The fifth category of learning is motor skills. Example of learning outcome: executing performances involving the use of muscles. For example, doing the steps of the Singkil dance. Conditions of learning. First, present verbal or other guidance to cue the executive subroutine. Second, arrange repeated practice. Third, furnish immediate feedback as to the accuracy of performance. And lastly, encourage the use of mental practice. Since we already learned the first principle, let's proceed to the second principle. The second principle is learning hierarchies define what intellectual skills are to be learned and a sequence of instruction. Gagne suggests that learning tasks for intellectual skills can be organized in a hierarchy according to complexity: stimulus recognition, response generation, procedure following, use of terminology, discriminations, concept formulation, rule application, and problem solving. Primary significance of the hierarchy is to identify prerequisites that should be completed to facilitate learning at each level. Prerequisites are identified by doing a task analysis of a learning or training task. Learning hierarchies provide a basis for the sequencing of instruction. Now let's proceed to the third Gagne principle. It is stated that events of learning operate on the learner in ways that constitute the conditions of learning. Events should satisfy or provide the necessary conditions for learning and serve as the basis for designing instruction and selecting appropriate media. The theory includes 9 instructional events and corresponding cognitive processes. Now let's talk about the 9 instructional events. First is gaining attention, which is reception. Second, informing learners of the objective, expectancy. Third, stimulating recall of prior learning, retrieval. Fourth is presenting the stimulus, selective perception. Fifth, providing learning guidance, semantic encoding. Sixth, eliciting performance, responding. Seventh, providing feedback, reinforcement. Eighth, assessing performance, retrieval. And lastly, enhancing retention and transfer, generalization. Here is an example of teaching sequences below using the 9 instructional events. So, lesson is all about equilateral triangles. The objective for the lesson is for students to create equilateral triangles. Target group, grade 4 pupils. So, number 1, gain attention. To gain the students' attention, we will show variety of computer-generated triangles. Number 2, identify objective. Pose a question saying, What is an equilateral triangle? Third, recall prior learning. Review definitions of triangles. Fourth, present stimulus. Give definition of equilateral triangle. Fifth, guide learning. We will show example of how to create an equilateral triangle. Sixth, elicit performance. Ask students to create 5 different examples. 7. Provide feedback. Check all examples as correct or incorrect. 8. Assess performance. Provide scores and remediation. And lastly, enhance retention or transfer. Show pictures of objects and ask students to identify equilaterals. That would be all for Gagne's conditions of learning. Thank you for listening.